Granted, that was our Mother's Day message. And my mind has been thinking about another subject for quite some time already, and I decided this would be a good Sunday to have it. And yesterday, when things started unfolding, I realized more and more this is going to be a day for mothers, and I guess I kind of dropped the ball on you. But anyway, we do have something we want to look at. I'd like to do a character study of the individual Caleb in the scriptures. And I'm not necessarily going to go through everything, but I'm just going to pick out some highlights, some things that I notice about him, and some things that I think are good for us all to recognize, and maybe a challenge to us, mothers included. So let's look at that. Let's turn to Numbers chapter 13. You can follow along. I'm not going to read everything. I'm just going to pick out some highlights. I sometimes have a tendency to kind of go along with my messages, so I was determined today I'm not going to do that. I'm going to try to stay the other way. So, but there are some things we want to look at. Numbers chapter 13. Most of us know the story of Caleb. Caleb was one of the 12 spies sent to spy out the land. Israel had been somewhat slaves in Egypt for 400 years. And we know the history. It was not a good time for them. They were suppressed. And yet, while they were there suppressed, there's an interesting thing that happened. The Egyptians, and rightfully so, they were concerned because the Israelites were not only gaining in number, they were also gaining in strength. And it was almost to the point where Egypt realized that if they're not careful here, Israel is going to be able to take over their country because of their strength and their numbers. And so they were trying to work on that. So that's kind of a history of what's behind. And then we have God delivering Israel out of Egypt, and we know that story well. And they were in the wilderness, and it's now 40 days that they have left Egypt. And a lot of things took place in those 40 days. But they're nearing the promised land where God had promised them. And we see how God had been working all the way up through in the details, the things that happened along the way, going through the wilderness. And we look at the event at the Red Sea and the way God gave them water. He gave them manna. There's just so many things that were happening along the way that Israel could see God's hand in what was taking place. And now they're coming close to the promised land. And Joshua, if we look at Numbers chapter 13, I'd like to point out something there. It mentions in the first part of the chapter all the individual, they picked an individual from each tribe, and they were sending them to scope out the land. I'd like to read a few verses starting in verse 18. This is Joshua's instruction to the 12 men that he was sending out. And see the land, what it is, and the people that dwelleth therein, whether they be strong or weak, few or many, and what the land is that they dwell in, whether it be good or bad, and what cities they be that they dwell in, whether in tents or in strongholds, and what the land is, whether it be fat or lean, or whether there is wood therein or not. And be ye of good courage, and bring of the fruit of the land. Now the time was the time of the first ripe grapes. So we see Joshua giving them some instructions, and he's saying, look what kind of people are there. Are they strong or are they weak? Are their cities walled? Is it a secure place? Just kind of check some things out and check the land. Is it fertile? Does it grow good things? And we know the story, how they came back and gave the report, and we'll look at that just a little bit later. But I'd like to look at verse 22. I'd like to point out something there. And they ascended by the south and came unto Hebron. In other words, they started in the south and went all the way up to the Hebron area. And it says where Ahiman, Shishai, and Talmai, the children of Anak, were. Now Hebron was built 7 years before Zoan in Egypt. What I'd like to point out is they went zigzagged around through the country, I'm assuming, And they ended up in Hebron. And they noticed in Hebron, that's where the giants lived. There were names three men here. And I'm assuming they were kind of the fathers of the giants. But there were giants living in the land, in this area, in the area of Hebron. And they made their little circle, came back, picked up some fruit. And it says the grape was so big they had to carry it on a stick between them. One cluster of grapes. So there were a lot of things that they saw and they observed. And they were following the instructions of Joshua. And then we come back. And I'd like to drop down to verse 27. And now here's the spies giving a report to Joshua. And they told him and said, We came into the land whither thou sentest us, and surely it floweth with milk and honey, and this is the fruit of it. Nevertheless, the people be strong that dwell in the land, and the cities are walled and very great. And moreover, we saw the children of Anak there. The Amalekites dwell in the land of the south, and the Hittites, and by the Jebusites, and the Amorites dwell in the mountains, and the Canaanites dwell by the sea, by the coast of Jordan. And Caleb stilled the people before Moses and said, Let us go up at once and possess it, for we are able to overcome it. But the people that went up with him said, We are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we. And they brought up an evil report of the land which they had searched unto the children of Israel, saying, The land through which we have gone to search it is a land that eateth up the inhabitants thereof. And all the people that we saw there are men of great stature. And we saw there giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants, and we are in our own sight as grasshoppers, and so were we in their sight. In other words, what they're saying here is that we just felt like grasshoppers among these men. We're small and they're so big. And it says that's how they looked at us too. They just looked at us like we're grasshoppers. And they were giving an evil report, but I'd like to point out something interesting, and that is Caleb's statement. You know, they gave a report and said it was bad. Caleb didn't disagree that the men were big. There were giants there. He didn't disagree with that. But listen what he said in verse 30. He said, Let us go up at once and possess it, for we are able to overcome it. I think that's very interesting that Caleb said that. Did he see the giant? Of course he did. He saw the giants there. But you know, Caleb also, I think, had his eyes open from the time they left Egypt until this point. He saw what God was doing. There was no question in his mind that if they follow God, God's going to take care of the situation. You see, that's the faith that Caleb had. That's the faith that Caleb had. After this report, if we go to Numbers chapter 14, it says, And the congregation lifted up their voice and cried, and the people wept all night. The next morning they murmured against Moses and Aaron. And they were saying, it would have been better if we would have just died in Egypt. Or why doesn't God just let us die in the wilderness? And that was their murmuring. And it's interesting, if you look at verse 4, it says, And they said one to another, Let us make us a captain, and let us return to Egypt. That's quite a statement. How many times, when people take things into their own hands, it doesn't end up well? See, God had a plan. But they rebelled. They did not follow God's plan. They wanted to do their own thing. And here they went so far as to say, well, let's just make us a captain. We'll just go back to Egypt. We'll serve Egypt. And I don't really know why they thought this way. If you remember what happened in Egypt before they left, Egypt was basically totally destroyed. If they would just think, why would they want to go back there? There's nothing left there. They were stripped of pretty much everything. But you see, that's how nearsighted they were. That's how Satan had blinded their eyes. It says in verse 6, And Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb the son of Jephunneh, which were of them that searched the land, rent their clothes. And they spake unto the company of the children of Israel, saying, The land which we passed through to search it, is an exceeding good land. If the Lord delight in us, then he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land which floweth with milk and honey. Now listen to his next statement. Here's what Caleb says. Only rebel not ye against the Lord, neither fear the people of the land, for they are bread for us. Their defense is departed from them, and the Lord is with us. Fear them not. You see, he saw the picture. He said, the Lord is with us, fear them not. But all the congregation bade stone them with stones. In other words, they picked up stones to stone Joshua and Caleb because they did not agree with what they were telling him. An interesting thing happens at the end of verse 10. It says, and the glory of the Lord appeared in the tabernacle of the congregation. In other words, God saw what was happening, and all of a sudden, there was the presence of God. And what do we see Moses doing? Moses, in the next several verses, we're not going to take the time to read it, but Moses pleads to God for Israel. God was ready to just get rid of these guys that rebel against him and go with who was left, the younger ones, and go into the promised land. And these people were telling Moses and Aaron that, all our children, we're going to go over there and they're going to destroy us, but they're going to take our children and our wives and they're going to treat them bad, and you know the story. But Moses pleads with God, and God says, I'm not going to destroy them, but those who murmured against me are not going to go to the promised land. We're going to stay in the wilderness. We're going to travel in the wilderness. I'm putting in my own words. But we're going to wait until all those people die off. And then we're going to take the very young ones that they said are going to be servants to the giants. We're going to take them and we're going to go in. The next generation, basically, is what he was saying. We're going to take them in. Now, this is God speaking, and we know the story. There's something interesting that happens. I don't know if you caught it in this story before, but, we'll get to this a little bit later. First, I'd like to look a little bit what God is saying. There's an interesting verse in chapter 14, verse 24. God is saying that, he's going to bring a pestilence on the people and he's going to take them back to the wilderness. In verse 24, he says, but my servant Caleb, because he hath another spirit with him and hath followed me fully, him will I bring into the land where you went, and his seed to possess it. And also included Joshua with that if you read some of the other verses. But I'd like to point out, you see, Caleb stood up, and he says, why are you rebelling against the Lord? Can't you see what God has done for us up until this point? Why are you rebelling against him? We can go take these people, not because they're small, but because God is with us. It says here that God makes a statement that Caleb had another spirit within him. And he also says that he hath followed me fully. I'd like to note that God recognized that Caleb was following him. God recognized the spirit of Caleb. And I think God recognizes his faithful people today. And when we are faithful to God, sometimes it seems maybe the road is hard or things don't go our way. Remember this, God recognizes his faithful followers. That's something that we can take from this. I think that's important. God goes on to say, and he's telling them all the things that he's going to do, take them back to the wilderness, and he says he's going to leave them in the wilderness. They have been gone from Egypt for 40 days, and God says he's going to leave them in the wilderness 40 years, 1 year for each day that they've been on their journey. And so it's going to be 40 years until they go in. Look at chapter 14, verse 36. And the men which Moses sent to search the land, who returned and made all the congregation to murmur against him by bringing up a slander upon the land, even those men that did bring up the evil report upon the land died by the plague before the Lord. It seems that God, he told the men who murmured against Moses and Aaron, he told them what was going to happen. But it seems like almost right away, the other 10 spies, it seems like a plague hit them and they died before the Lord, is what it says. God dealt with those men. Now, it's interesting to notice that, because if you go on down to the rest of this chapter, some of the men against the recommendation of Moses and Aaron, they decided they're going to go into the land anyway and try to possess it. They're going to do things on their own strength. And they tried it, and guess what happened? They were defeated. It says they were discomfited. They were scattered. And, again, we cannot do things in our own strength. We can only do things through God's strength. But these men decided to do it on their own, and they got in trouble. So what do? They go back to the wilderness for 40 years. Now that brings us, let's turn over to Joshua chapter 14 now, those who are following along. I'd like to pick up this story. We're skipping a big part of what happened here, the time in the wilderness and the way God brought them into the land of Canaan, how they defeated Jericho and took the land, possessed the land. Now it's coming to the point where they have conquered the land, and they're dividing the land to the 12 tribes, and they're giving each tribe a possession, an area where it's their land. And this again speaks of the faithfulness of God. God told them he was going to give them this land. And here they are, and God is giving it to them. And now if you turn to Joshua chapter 14, I'd like to begin reading in verse 6. Then the children of Judah came unto Joshua in Gilgal, and Caleb the son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite said unto them, Thou knowest the thing that the Lord said unto Moses, the man of God, concerning me and thee in Kadesh Barnea. 40 years old was I when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to spy the land. And I brought him word again, as it was in mine heart. Nevertheless, my brethren that went up with me made the heart of the people to melt, but I wholly followed the Lord my God. Hear his statement. I wholly followed the Lord my God. And Moses sware on that day, saying, Surely the land whereupon thy feet have trodden shall be thine inheritance, and thy children's forever, because thou hast wholly followed the Lord my God. And now behold, the Lord hath kept me alive, as he said, these 45 years, even since the Lord spake this word unto Moses, while the children of Israel wandered in the wilderness. And now, lo, I am this day 85 years old. As yet I am as strong this day as I was the day that Moses sent me, and my strength was then, even so as my strength was then, even so is my strength now, for war, both to go out and to come in. Now therefore, give me this mountain, whereof the Lord spake in that day. For thou heardest in that day how the Anakims were there, and that the cities were great and fenced. If so be the Lord will be with me, then I shall be able to drive them out, as the Lord said. And Joshua blessed him, and gave unto Caleb the son of Jephunneh Hebron for an inheritance. Hebron therefore became the inheritance of Caleb the son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite unto this day, because that he wholly followed the Lord God of Israel. We could go on reading there. But you see, Caleb had a long detour in his life. He had a long detour in his life. It was 45 years that he waited for this blessing. He waited for God to give him what he had promised him for 45 years. During this 45 years, I'd like to point out, Caleb says he has wholeheartedly followed the Lord his God. Isn't that amazing? He didn't give up. He had the faith that God was going to reward him and give him what he promised him. Now, I'd like to stop here and think about us. Do we ever have detours in our lives? God ever send you on a detour? Maybe you had a goal in mind and you thought, this is my goal in life. This is what God wants me to do. And in the meantime, God takes you some long journey another way. That ever happened to you? Most of us who are older, at least, can look back and see that in our lives. But you know, it's when we are on the detour that God teaches us a lot of things. It's during the detour. How many of you drive down the road and you have a detour and it's going to take more time? And you know, when you're on the detour, you see a lot of things you would never see otherwise. It's like that spiritually as well. When God takes us on a detour, I think sometimes he's trying to show us things that we would miss otherwise. I think of people who had detours in their lives. I think of Moses. He was in the wilderness 40 years before God used him. I think of Joseph. From a young child, God was developing him. But it was many, many years later, after he was taken a prisoner, sold as a slave, put in prison. It was many years later until God called him out and had him do what he was specifically supposed to do. And you know, God has something for all of us to do, but many times he takes us a long way around and teaches us lessons and brings us and molds and shapes us into what he would have us to be before he really can use us as we ought. Many others as well. I think of David. I think of some of the New Testament. God didn't just... Yes, God wants us to be his children, and God uses us along the way. If you look at Joseph, you look at Moses, you know, they were men of integrity along the way, and we could pick up things in their lives. They weren't just being idle. They were in God's service, just like Caleb was. Caleb was faithful the whole way through. But you know, when it came time for Israel to possess the land, I like what Caleb says. He says, I'm just as strong as I ever was. But he says, give me this mountain. This right here is where I want to be. I want to be in Hebron. Why did he pick Hebron? Any ideas? Who lived at Hebron? The children of Anak. Why did Caleb choose the very spot where the giants lived to be his inheritance? Why would he do that? Any thoughts? He trusted God and he wholly followed him. And if you want my personal opinion, I think this was just a confirmation in Caleb's life that I have won. God has given me what I wanted. You see, we have defeated the giants. And he wanted to live right there to prove it. And I think it was a testimony to his children. And you know, what a great victory for Caleb. It took him all those years. But in the end, God rewarded him for his faithfulness. And you know, all of us, we're living today, we have a crown of righteousness promised to us as well. But there are things that we experience even in this life. But remember, God has a reward for those who are faithful. And if we follow him wholeheartedly, we can claim that promise someday. We can do what Joshua said. Give me this mountain. This is where I want to be, or this is where I want to serve, or whatever it is. But in the meantime, when God takes us on the detour, let's not be disappointed. It's during the detours that we become closer and closer to God. And God wants to just simply bless all of us. But many times, God's blessing comes after a period of testing and seeing who we really are. And it's not just testing, it's molding and shaping. God is preparing all of us for a great work. And if it's in this life or if it's in the future life, there is a reward. And God has promised it. And so let's be faithful and serve and follow him. Lord bless you.